Today, I'm going to tell you about another crime against white people, which has received very little attention in the mainstream press. Although a few reporters have mentioned it, it is, like the Wichita Massacre, not a subject of nightly or weekly reports. It has never been the subject of a major film or documentary, and the sitcoms and jiggle shows are never interrupted to report on it. It's not a major issue, as defined by the Michael Eisners and Sumner Redstones of this world. And this crime is committed directly against white people by Jews themselves. It is the crime of slavery, specifically the sex slavery of white women captured by Jewish gangs and forced to serve in brothels in Israel and elsewhere. The few articles that do get written about this sex slavery almost never refer to Jews as the perpetrators. Instead, the politically correct euphemisms Russian gangs, Russian organized crime, and Russian mafia are used. There are hardly any real Russians involved in these white slavery rings, or in so-called Russian organized crime at all, as the journalists who write these articles well know. The journalists also well know that if they emphasize the Jewish nature of these traffickers in white women, that they would quickly find themselves without employment. The enticement into sex slavery begins with poverty. Russia and her former communist satellites in Eastern Europe were bled dry economically by the Jew-created communist system for many decades. When that system collapsed, opportunistic capitalists and former communists suddenly turned reformers, many of them Jews, moved in for the easy pickings and bought privatized industries, took advantage of naive whites unaccustomed to predatory business practices, and looted large sections of Eastern Europe yet again, leaving the people impoverished, dirt poor, and precariously close to starving, despite the fact that the Eastern Europeans are among the most highly cultured and educated white peoples on earth. To anyone who uses the Internet, it's notorious that Russians and Ukrainians and Moldovans want to escape their poverty and leave for the West. Young women by the thousands are advertising themselves for marriage to Western men on dozens of matchmaker sites. Many breadwinners in those countries earn less than the equivalent of $30 a month. So when the well-groomed woman in line at the snowbound railway station, or the two-line classified ad in the local paper, promises 30 or 60 times that for easy housework or waitress jobs overseas, it's no wonder that these desperately poor women say yes by the thousands. A large number end up in Israel, where the sex slavery of white women is especially common, and seldom even noticed by the authorities who give it their tacit approval. But the Jewish gangs have worldwide networks, and enslaved white women are sold to Jewish-controlled brothels in Europe, Turkey, and as far afield as Asia. Let's listen to the stories of some of these women. Lara Matveyeva had no idea that the kindly stranger who offered her a way out of poverty was a recruiter for a Jewish white slave ring. In her case, she was promised a job doing easy housework in Germany, watering the plants and feeding family pets. When she arrived in Hamburg, the gang followed their usual first step for soon-to-be slaves with passports. They took the passport from her for safekeeping, they said, thus making her technically an illegal alien and outside the normal protection of the law. After 3 days, she was told what her real job was. She was to work as a prostitute at a Hamburg brothel. Even though she determined at once to return home, she was imprisoned for 6 months at various brothels masquerading as bars and nightclubs until she finally escaped. Back home, she says that most of the other sex slaves she met there were so afraid of their captors that they had given up trying to escape. Even today, Lara does not use her real name for fear of retaliation from the Jewish gangs who own her. She says, quote, "I'm not scared of anything anymore because the worst thing that could possibly happen to me already has. Very few of the women I met had willingly become prostitutes. Most were tricked. Most alarming was the sense that there was no way out. Our passports had been taken. We didn't know what punishment would face us if we went to the police. We were illegal immigrants involved in an illegal activity. We didn't expect any sympathy. To begin with, I refused to do the work, but later I had to. There was no other way of feeding myself, and by that time I had seen the beatings other women got when they refused to cooperate." Close quote. The women are told that they have to work off their debts before they can go free. Impossibly high figures that are arbitrarily increased by their captors as fines if they refuse to submit to any sexual degradation demanded, including gang rape. When one Jewish pimp decides he needs fresh goods, the women are sold to others, often again and again in a single year, with the debts they owe the pimps going up with each transaction. Human rights groups estimate that 500,000 white women have been captured and abused by these Jewish gangs, and that number is from Russia alone. 500,000. 21-year-old Irina thought she was going to be a dancer when she got off the boat from Ukraine to Haifa, Israel. Within a few days, she was driven to a whorehouse where her new Jewish boss burned her passport before her eyes. "I own you," he said. "You are my property, and you will work until you earn your way out. Don't try to leave. You have no papers, and you don't speak Hebrew. You will be arrested and deported. Then we will get you and bring you back." End of quote. At first, she refused to be a prostitute, but the beatings and repeated rapes by her owners eventually broke her spirit. Irina says, quote, "I don't think the man who ruined my life will ever be fined." Close quote. Until recently, white slavery wasn't even against the law in Israel, and it was only under intense international pressure that Israel finally passed laws restricting it last year. But prosecutions are very rare and sentences light. The enslavement of white women is essentially winked at by the authorities there, who, after all, are steeped in a tradition that only Jews are truly human beings. And these white sex slaves aren't Jews. And pimps prostituting white women to all comers, as long as the owners claim the women were not actually purchased by them, is still legal there. Marco Buffo, the head of an anti-slavery group in Italy, stated, quote, "It's no secret that the highest prices now go for the white women. They are the novelty item now." Close quote. Mikhail Lebed, chief of criminal investigations of the Ukrainian Interior Ministry, states, quote, "Gangsters make more from these women in a week than we have in our law enforcement budget for the whole year. To be honest, unless we get some help, we are not going to stop it." Close quote. And the Jewish media are helping to bring these criminals to justice and get the Russians and Ukrainians the help and publicity they need, right? Recently, Yitzhak Tyler of the Haifa police spilled the beans on some of the operations in that Israeli port city. Quote, "These men pay $500 to $1,000 for a Ukrainian or Russian woman. Do you understand what I am telling you? They will buy these women and make a fortune out of them. Take a small place with 10 girls. Each has 15 to 20 clients a day. Multiply that by, say, 200 shekels. So say 30,000 shekels a day comes into each place. Each girl works 25 days a month, minimum. So we are talking about 750,000 shekels a month, or about $215,000. A man often owns 5 of these places. That's $1 million. No taxes, no real overhead. It's a factory with slave labor. And we've got them all over Israel.
This is the
Close
Gold Star
quote.
Massage Parlor.
$1
Here, the
million
women are exclusively
a
Russian.
month.
Unlike
for an
massage parlors in the
average
West,
Jew
this
pimp
establishment
in
is a
Israel.
social gathering spot for men.
What do the women
They can
get?
come in, enjoy a
Beatings,
drink and conversation
rapes,
with their friends,
forced
and then get a
performance of
massage,
sex on demand,
which usually
and a little
includes
food and
sexual
cigarette
services.
money. Bars on the windows, marching naked in Jewish slave markets when they're sold again for maybe the 4th time this year. Gang violence and retaliation on their families if they escape. Punishment and deportation at best from a complicit legal system. The Jewish pimps are so confident of their invulnerability that one of them, Jacob Golan, owner of 3 houses of prostitution including Tel Aviv's Tropicana, even spoke to the New York Times stating, quote, "Israelis love Russian girls. They are blonde and good-looking and different from us," he said, chuckling as he drew his hand over his black hair. "And they are desperate. They are ready to do anything for money." Always filled with half-naked Russian women, the club is open around the clock. There are 12 cubicles at the Tropicana where 20 women work in shifts. 8 during the daytime, 12 at night. Business is always booming, and not just with foreign workers. Israeli soldiers with rifles on their shoulders frequent the place, as do business executives and tourists. Mr. Golan was asked if most women who work at the club do so voluntarily. He laughed heartily. Close quote. In a supreme piece of bitter irony, the reporter noted that Golan has posted a missing poster for an Israeli woman near the front counter of his sex club. His concern is so touching, isn't it? The United Nations now admits that the selling of sex slaves is now organized crime's fastest growing business. And most of these slaves are white women. The Sydney Morning Herald states that white women are, quote, "the most lucrative commodity of all," close quote, surpassing even the international drug trade in importance. After all, drugs can be sold only once, and then they are used up. White women can be used and then brought to the slave markets again and again for years until they are dead or no longer attractive. Mariana's story is typical. Lured by promises of easy work and good money, she left Russia for Israel. Quote, "The brothel routine was brutal and efficient. She worked 7 days a week, servicing up to 20 customers a day, both Jewish and Arab. A man stood guard near the door of her room, furnished sparely with a bed, a dresser, a shower, and a sink. She was isolated from the outside world, except for a woman who stopped each day to sell food to her and the other Russian girls. Telephone calls home to assure her parents that work was fine were monitored. After about 5 months, Mariana was allowed to leave the one-story gray building with a driver to meet clients at a Tel Aviv hotel. 3 days later, a group of men drugged her in a cabana behind the hotel. "Do what we say. Don't kick and don't scream. There's no point in fighting," she remembers them saying, before they gang raped her. Desperate, she tried to escape the brothel, but was caught. Close quote. The Russian government admits that 100,000 women were smuggled out of the country by these Jewish gangs in 1 year alone, making the human rights group's estimate of 500,000 enslaved Russian women look very conservative. And that, I emphasize, is only Russia. Doros Michael of the Immigrant Support Action Group in Cyprus explains that white women are the most sought-after sex slaves. Quote, "Russian women are thought to be more educated, more beautiful, and more white than Asian women." Close quote. Amnesty International has issued reports harshly criticizing Israel's toleration of the sex slave industry. I wonder whether you have heard about that on Fox News, or CBS, or CNN. Amnesty International stated, quote, "The government of Israel failed to take appropriate steps to prevent, investigate, try, and punish those responsible for the violations of human rights committed against traded women." They also cited the case of 27-year-old Valentina, who said, quote, "The conditions were horrible. Most of the girls suffered from venereal diseases. There was nowhere to run. There were bars on the windows and guards all the time, day and night." Close quote. Valentina eventually was able to leap from a second-story window, evade the Israeli police, and escape to tell her tale. But thousands of other white women and girls are still there. One young Russian woman, Larissa, says that she managed to escape from her pimp only to be arrested by the Israeli police, who then sold her to another pimp who admitted he was a former Israeli police officer. These white slaves are without hope and without friends. The few Jews who oppose this slave trade are outside the power structure in Israel, and white people in the West are grazing contentedly in the pasture of consumerism, uninformed about white slavery because the Jewish-owned media don't tell them about it. At a recent human rights conference sponsored by the World Coalition Against Trafficking in Women, it was estimated that there are more than 200 sex slave brothels in Tel Aviv alone. It was also stated, quote, "When they arrive in Israel, they go through an educational seminar that includes rape and sale by auction, after which their passports are taken from them and they are imprisoned in sealed apartments. They are forced to work in prostitution in order to repay the debt incurred in bringing them to Israel." Close quote. A few former sex slaves had the courage to speak out. Quote, "I am Ilona. I was sold for $15,000, and a few months later I was sold once more. They forced me to accept 150 clients a week. Lots of people knew about me and the other girls. There were taxi drivers and people from the grocery store who brought alcohol, and also the doctors who gave us pills against pregnancy. Take them all month long so that we wouldn't lose any work because of the blood. And the doctors checked us after we were beaten and gave us painkillers. But the worst thing happened with the policemen who knew about me. One time I managed to run away and went to the police. They referred me to a policeman who knew Russian, and I spoke with him, and he listened very intently. An hour after he listened so intently, my boss, the pimp, arrived at the station and took me home, and there he gave me the worst beating, so that all the girls would see what happens if you run away. After that, I couldn't work for a few days." Close quote. Quote, "I am Yana. At the airport I was picked up by Ilyosha. I had 6 or 7 clients a day on Ben Yehuda, and I made him 600 to 700 shekels a day. I got food, cigarettes, and 20 shekels a day. After 2 weeks he sold me to Peter and Gershon, and I worked for a month at their massage parlor. 10 or 15 clients a day, 150 shekels for half an hour, and for me, 20 shekels a day, food and cigarettes. After 2 months, Peter sent me to another bar. Whenever I wasn't working, I was locked in an apartment, and they brought me whatever I needed. Peter said that I could go after I had made him $40,000. I had between 7 and 10 clients a day at the bar, and there I had to earn 700 shekels. If I had a slow day, I had to work harder the next day. They also beat me at the massage parlor, the employees and the manager." Close quote. A charity group that tries to help Russian children and women and prevent them from being ensnared by these Jewish white slave rings, Miramed, estimates that 90% of the women who leave Russia in the clutches of these Jews are not aware that they are headed for prostitution. And I add that none are aware that they will be enslaved behind bars, forced to satisfy the lusts of their Jewish owners on demand, and be sold as slaves again and again in Jewish slave markets. The Jewish media have obsessed for decades about black slavery in North America, a slavery that was abolished by white people and which hasn't existed for over 130 years. But how often have you heard of the enslavement of whites, which is going on right now. I want all of you who hear my voice today to swear in the holy sanctuary of your soul that you will never forget what the Jews have done and are doing to more than 500,000 of our women and girls. And I want you to promise me that you will never forget the Jewish media bosses who cry crocodile tears for months when a black criminal meets a policeman's nightstick, but who turn a blind eye to the sex slavery of enough white women to fill Rockford, Illinois 3 times over. When I say never forget, I mean never trust them again. Never trust them again. Never trust them again.